The desert does not bury, it consumes. It swallowed an empire of pillars, a city called Ubar, leaving behind only whispers carried by the wind. To some it was wealth beyond imagination, to others it was arrogance punished by the divine. But to those who dared to search, it became something else entirely, a trap woven of sand, silence, and secrets too dangerous to speak. The desert at night is never silent, though the world appears still beneath its endless canopy of stars. The sand itself speaks. It sighs as the wind drifts across its surface. It shivers when the cold sets in, and it whispers secrets no man dares repeat aloud. To those who dwell in the shifting wilderness, silence is only an illusion. The Bedouins know this better than anyone, for they live where the dunes move like waves, swallowing paths, ruins, and sometimes entire lives. And it was on one such night, when the fire burned low and the shadows stretched long, that the men of the caravan gathered to tell the story that never truly dies, the story of Ubar, the city of 1,000 pillars. The night was unusually cold, the kind of cold that stings the bones even through woolen robes. Camels huddled against one another, their broad shapes looming like dark statues at the edge of firelight. Beyond them, the dunes rolled into infinity, the sea frozen in motion. A boy of barely 10 winters leaned closer to the flames, his eyes wide as an elder cleared his throat. The man's voice was cracked by age and sand, yet it carried weight, as if he were less a storyteller and more a vessel for something ancient. They say there was once a city in this desert. The elder began, his hand stretched toward the fire. A city so tall its pillars reached for the very heavens, so rich that caravans stretched for miles, and so arrogant that its people believed themselves untouchable, even by God himself. The boy shivered, though not from the cold. "And where is this city now?" he whispered. The elder's eyes glimmered, swallowed, lost to the sands. The desert is its grave, and the wind its mourner. A hush fell over the circle, for in those words lingered a fear older than memory. The idea that the desert itself is alive, that it keeps what it chooses and buries what it despises. The men shifted uneasily, and one spat into the fire to chase away bad luck. But the story was not finished. "It was called Ubar," the elder continued, "but some know it as Iram of the Pillars. Once, travelers came from distant kingdoms to marvel at its splendor. Gold shimmered on every threshold, spices perfumed the streets, and its kings drank from goblets studded with jewels plundered from every corner of the earth. Yet pride was its downfall. They defied the heavens, built their towers higher, mocked the prophets who warned them, and carved their arrogance into every stone. And so, when their laughter reached the sky answered. Some say God himself struck them down. Others say the desert, jealous and vengeful, rose up and devoured them whole." The boy's lips parted as if he could already see the towers crumbling, the streets cracking, the people screaming as sand poured into their mouths. Around him, the fire snapped, casting sparks into the air like fleeting souls. One of the younger men scoffed. "It is a tale for children. Cities do not vanish. Sand buries bones, not pillars." The elder only smiled, a bitter smile, as if it seemed more than he wished to. "Then tell me, why do travelers hear voices in the dunes? Why do some return from the empty corridor, raving of towers rising in the heat haze, only to vanish the next night? Why do we find pillars buried in places no city should stand? If it is only a tale, why does the desert keep telling it?" The wind seemed to rise at his words, hissing over the dunes, carrying with it a sound that might have been laughter or weeping or both. The boy clutched his cloak tighter, his heart beating fast. Later that night, as the fire dimmed and the stars wheeled overhead, the caravan lay restless. The men pulled their cloaks over their heads and whispered prayers before sleep. But one man did not pray. He sat apart, sharpening the blade of his dagger, his eyes fixed on the dunes as if expecting them to move. His name was Khalid, and he had crossed the desert more times than he could count. He was no fool for myths, yet he never mocked the whispers. "The desert breathes," Khalid said quietly, his voice carrying over the wind. The boy, who had not yet fallen asleep, lifted his head. "What do you mean?" Khalid did not turn to him. "It breathes. At night, if you listen closely, you can hear it inhale and exhale beneath the sand. as if something beneath waits to rise. The boy swallowed hard. "And have you heard it?" Khalid finally looked at him, his eyes dark and haunted. "Too many times." No more was said, but the boy lay awake, listening, straining, his small body trembling beneath his blanket. And then, though it may have been only the wind, he thought he heard it, a low groan, deep and heavy, as though pillars of stone shifted beneath the earth. The sound vibrated through him, ancient and terrible, before fading back into silence. The boy dared not move, dared not even breathe, for in that moment, he believed every word of the elder's tale. He believed that Ubar was real and that it had not been destroyed but buried alive, struggling even now to breathe through the weight of centuries of sand. When the dawn came, it was pale and weak. The caravan packed in silence, the men's faces drawn, their eyes rimmed with shadows. The boy was the first to notice it. The absence. A child, younger than himself, was missing. His sleeping mat lay empty, his shoes untouched, his blanket cast aside as if he had risen quickly. At first, they thought he had gone to relieve himself in the dunes. But his mother's cry cut through the morning air. The boy was nowhere to be found. The men spread out, their footprints pressing into the cool morning sand, calling his name. And then they saw it, a trail of small footprints, perfectly formed, leading away from the camp. They wound into the dunes, each step clear, each toe and heel pressed deep. But there was something strange. There were no returning steps, no drag marks, no sign of struggle. Just footprints, walking calmly, as though the boy had followed some unseen guide into the desert. The mother wailed, collapsing into the sand. The father stood frozen, his hands clutching his head, his face ashen. The men stared in silence, for what chilled them most was not the trail itself, but where it ended. The footprints led to a dune, and there, only there, they vanished. No body, no sign, no disturbance but the faint shifting of sand, as though the desert had inhaled. The boy who had listened to Khalid's words a night before felt his blood run cold. The desert had breathed, just as Khalid had said, and it had taken a child into its lungs. The elder closed his eyes, whispering prayers. Khalid said nothing. He only stared at the dune, his jaw tight, as though he had seen this before. And in the silence that followed, the wind rose again, carrying with it a low, mournful groan, like the sound of pillars shifting beneath the earth. The fire of the previous night seemed a distant memory now, replaced by the fire of dread in their hearts. The legend was no longer a story. It had reached into their lives, stolen breath and blood, and left them with nothing but fear. And as the caravan turned to leave that cursed place, the boy, the listener, the dreamer, looked back at the vanishing footprints. He knew with a certainty that terrified him. Ubar was real, and it had just claimed another soul. Dust hung in the air of the forgotten library like the ghosts of centuries past, each mote catching the pale light that bled through the narrow slits of arched windows. The place had been abandoned for decades, perhaps centuries, yet still held the weight of reverence, as though knowledge itself lingered here even after the scribes had long turned to bone. Shelves leaned against cracked walls, their spines warped and broken. Scrolls unfurling with the desert wind had sneaked in to claim them. It was a graveyard of words, and yet, among the decay, one manuscript waited. The man who found it was no ordinary wanderer. His name was Alistair Crane, an English explorer whose obsession with vanished civilizations had dragged him from the jungles of South America to the frozen tombs of Siberia. He was not young, but neither had time dulled his hunger for discovery. There was something in his eyes that spoke of unfinished quests, of answers always just out of reach. And now, in the silence of his forsaken archive deep within Muscat's crumbling old quarter, he felt the hairs on his neck rise as his fingers brushed over a tattered manuscript, its cover worn thin by hands long dead. He should have dismissed it as one of 1,000 relics crumbling in the dark. But there was something peculiar. The manuscript bore no title, yet its leather seemed fresh in the tomes beside it, as if resisting the centuries. When he pulled it free, a puff of dust erupted, and for a moment, he thought he heard a whisper echo from within the walls. He froze, listening. Nothing, only silence, heavy and thick. With careful reverence, he laid the book on a table where the moonlight crept through, The parchment was brittle, yellowed like the teeth of the dead. He turned the first page, expecting script in Arabic or perhaps Greek. Instead, the words blurred before his eyes. He blinked, leaned closer, and felt his breath falter. The ink moved, not as if it were fresh, not as if it were smudged, but as if it were alive. Under the pale glow of the moonlight, the lines shimmered faintly, curling into shapes and bending like snakes across the page. Alistair staggered back, rubbing his eyes. Yet when he looked again, the letters had settled into an inscription, Iram of the Pillars. The name struck him like a blow, for he knew it well, from legends told in whispers around desert fires. Iram, the cursed city, the Atlantis of sands. Scholars debated its existence endlessly, dismissing it as myth, yet here it was, inscribed in a book that had no place existing. His heart pounded. He leaned forward, tracing the words with a trembling finger. It was no mere story written here. As he turned the page, his eyes widened. It was a map. The parchment stretched with faint lines, sketches of dunes, mountains, and routes marked in strange, jagged symbols. At the center, rising like a scar, was a circle of pillars drawn in black ink. Beneath it, a single word scrawled, Ubar. Alistair's throat went dry. His life had been consumed by cities whispered but never found. He had failed at Troy, failed at El Dorado, failed at Hyperborea. Yet now it felt as though fate itself had placed this into his hands. He whispered aloud, his voice barely more than breath, the city of 1,000 pillars. The library seemed to shiver at his words. A draft of cold air swept through. Though the windows were shut, his lamp flickered, and in that wavering light, he thought he saw the ink shift again, not wildly, not dramatically, but subtly, as if the roads and lines bent ever so slightly. He frowned, bending closer, and the strangest thought struck him. The map was breathing. Night fell deeper. Alistair sat transfixed, his eyes never leaving the parchment. At first, he thought the changes were tricks of the light, illusions of a tired mind. But the longer he stared, the clearer it became. The paths on the map did not remain still. They bent, twisted, redrew themselves in faint movements, like an animal shifting restlessly in sleep. And then something else. When his assistant arrived, a young scholar named Yusuf, he gasped at the sight. "This cannot be," Yusuf whispered, his hand over his mouth. "What do you see?" Alistair asked, heart hammering. "The river," Yusuf said, pointing. "It flows north here, past the oasis." Alistair blinked. On the map, he saw no river, only dunes stretching endlessly. "There is no river," he said firmly. Yusuf looked at him with horror. "It is right there, sir, clear as my own hand." A chill swept Alistair's spine. He turned away, then back. Still dunes. But Yusuf's face was pale with certainty. They were not seeing the same map. They tested it with another. A guard was brought in. The man stared at the parchment, scratched his head, and swore he saw a fortress surrounded by high walls, far from where either Alistair or Yusuf had seen anything. The three of them stared at one another, silent with dread. The map was not merely shifting. It was showing each man a different path, as if it knew what they sought, what they feared, what it wanted to lead them toward. Alistair felt unease seep into his bones. What manner of ink could do such a thing? What curse lay upon this book that changed its truth with every pair of eyes? He should have closed it then, sealed it away, cast it into fire. But obsession outweighed fear. He had chased Ubar's entire life through rumor and mirage. Now, it seemed the city was chasing him. That night, unable to resist, he carried the manuscript to his chambers. The moon was high, casting its silver gaze through the latticework. He placed the book on the table, his hands trembling. With each passing minute, the ink shimmered more vividly, as though feeding on the moonlight itself. The black lines glistened wet, like blood not yet dried. And then, as he leaned closer, the impossible happened. The ink began to drip. Tiny beads swelled at the edges of the lines, quivering before falling onto the parchment below. They did not smudge, they did not dry. They formed new shapes, bleeding into coordinates, numbers, symbols he half recognized from Arabic astronomy. His breath hitched. The map was rewriting itself before his eyes, marking a path into the heart of the empty quarter, a path no map in history had ever shown. The droplets bled steadily, forming a trail, and as they spread, he felt his chest tighten. A smell rose from the parchment, metallic, sharp, unmistakable. It was the smell of blood. Alistair staggered back, his chair scraping against the stone floor. The manuscript glistened, alive with ink that was no ink at all. He could not look away, though terror screamed through him. The bleeding lines finished their path, circling a point deep in the desert, far beyond any known settlement, a place no caravan dared cross, a place where countless had vanished. And beneath that circle, the word appeared again, bold and final, Ubar. The candle guttered. The room seemed to close in, and though Alistair was alone, he felt eyes upon him, thousands of them, watching the parchment through the very veil of time. He dared to blink, and in that blink, he thought he saw faces shift in the ink, faces twisted in agony, eyes staring from beneath the sands. The manuscript trembled, as if breathing. Then it grew still. Alistair's hand shook as he reached for it again. Somewhere within him, a voice screamed to stop, to flee, to abandon the cursed book. Yet another voice, quieter, more seductive, whispered that this was destiny, that the sands had chosen him, that he alone could bring back the city, 1,000 pillars from its grave. He pressed his hand against the parchment. The ink was warm, and in that warmth he felt the pulse of something buried, something that was not yet dead. The wind rose outside, rattling the shutters like the laughter of unseen things. Somewhere in the library's forgotten depths, a door slammed, though no one was there. And Alistair Crane, explorer, skeptic, dreamer, realized with terror and awe that he now carried the path to Ubar. But whether it would lead him to glory or to a grave beneath the dunes, he could not yet know, for the ink had spoken and its voice was blood. The empty quarter has always carried names that whisper dread. Rub al-Khali, the abode of emptiness, a place so vast that the human mind cannot comprehend its silence. To the Bedouin, it is both home and grave, a shifting kingdom where the dunes swallow all arrogance and time itself feels lost. It was into this void that Alistair Crane prepared to march, armed not with courage but with obsession, driven by the bleeding coordinates of a cursed map that had promised him the unthinkable. The path to Ubar, the city of 1,000 pillars. The decision to form the expedition had been born out of desperation. Alistair had spent years chasing rumors, burning through his wealth and reputation. The map was his last chance, the final thread on which his life's purpose hung. But men were not eager to follow him. Word of the manuscript's strange ink spread quickly, whispered in taverns and among merchants, until it became less a discovery and more an omen. Some said the book had already claimed a soul, a guard who had vanished the night he first laid eyes on it, his mat empty in the dawn. Others swore the parchment carried voices, muttering in forgotten tongues when the moon was high. Yet money still speaks, even when curses walk in its shadow. And so, with gold promised, Alistair gathered a caravan of 30 men, 10 camels, and provisions for a journey no sane man would take. At his side rode Yusuf, the young scholar whose trembling hands had first traced the map's ink. Though he feared it, he could not abandon the dream of discovery. To him, Ubar was both salvation and damnation, and he could not tell which he desired more. The caravan set out at dawn. The desert greeted them with silence, vast and endless, its golden waves glittering as though each grain of sand were a star fallen from the heavens. The sun was merciless even in its rise, burning the horizon with a light that shimmered like molten metal. As they marched, the men murmured prayers, their lips cracked, their eyes darting to the dunes that seemed to watch them back. For the first days, progress was steady. The camels groaned under their burdens but pressed forward, their padded feet sinking into the endless sand. Nights brought brief reprieve, the stars spilling across the sky like spilled jewels. Around the fires, the men spoke little. When they did, the talk always circled back to the map. One of the guards swore that the ink had shifted since last he saw it. Another claimed that while he stared, the lines bled faintly, whispering as though carried by wind. Alistair silenced them, insisting it was imagination, exhaustion, fear. But deep in his heart, he knew the truth. The map was alive. By the fourth day, the desert began to show its teeth. Heat waves twisted the horizon, bending it into shapes that mocked reality. Towers rose and vanished. Rivers shimmered only to dry into dust when approached. Shadows followed the men even when the sun was at its peak, their forms bending wrong, stretched too long, as though they belonged not to men but to something lurking behind them. Yusuf was the first to notice. "Do you see them?" he whispered one evening, his eyes wide with terror. "See what?" Alistair snapped, though his voice shook. "The shadows," Yusuf said. "They are not ours." Alistair looked down. The fire flickered at his feet, and behind him his shadow stretched into sand. But there, another shadow moved beside his, bent forward as if whispering into his ear. He spun, dagger in hand, but there was no one, only the dunes silent and patient. The men began to murmur at night, speaking of voices carried on the wind. Some swore. They heard women wailing beneath the sands. Others said they saw children walking just beyond the firelight. Fear spread, and with it, resentment. Men glared at Alistair, their faces gaunt with distrust. Yet still they pressed forward, for greed is stronger than terror until terror bears its full face. On the sixth day, the camels halted. It was sudden, with no warning. The caravan had reached a long, flat stretch of desert, where the dunes lay smooth as silk. The map's bleeding coordinates pointed straight across. Yet when the handlers urged the camels forward, the beasts balked. They shifted, groaned, and then, one by one, they knelt, not as they would to rest, not as they would to be loaded. They knelt low, pressing their heads to the sand as though mourning. The men shouted, whipped them, tugged at their reins. Nothing. The camels refused to rise. Their great dark eyes were wide, reflecting something beyond human sight. They whimpered, a sound that seemed less animal and more human in its grief. The men froze, silence falling heavy. In Bedouin lore, camels are creatures tied to the soul of the desert, beasts that sense what no man can. If they mourned, it was not without reason. Yusuf's face drained of color. "They grieve the dead," he whispered. Alistair's chest tightened. He turned back to the map, his hands trembling. The ink shimmered faintly in the light, its lines bending into a circle that lay directly upon the sand before them. The camels would not cross it. Arguments erupted. Some demanded they turn back, others begged for rest. One man fell to his knees, pressing his ear to the ground. Moments later, he screamed. "They're under us," he cried. "The pillars. I hear them groaning." The men recoiled, horror etched into their faces. For just then, faint and low, a sound rose from beneath the earth, a deep moan, heavy and ancient, like stones straining under weight. It lasted only moments before fading, but it was enough. The desert was not empty. It breathed, as Khalid had once said. The handlers tried to drag the camels, but the beasts would not move. Panic broke. Half the men dropped their loads, swearing to return home before the sands claimed them. Alistair shouted, raged, threatened. His words were swallowed by the vastness. Yet greed and pride kept some bound to him, and so they pressed forward, dragging what supplies they could on their backs, leaving behind beasts that would not rise. But the desert was not finished. By the eighth day, the horizon darkened. At first, they thought it was the fall of night arriving early, but the sky remained bright, the sun still burning. The darkness was not above. It was around them. A wind rose, howling across the dunes. Sand lifted in waves, stinging their faces, clawing at their skin. The men shouted, but their voices vanished in the roar. The storm came with a fury that was not natural. The air thickened, turning day into twilight, the sun a faint orb swallowed by dust. The caravan scattered. Shapes vanished in the curtains of sand, their cries cut short. Men clutched one another only to be torn apart by invisible hands of wind. Camels screamed before being buried alive, their forms swallowed as if the earth itself had opened. Alistair staggered forward, clutching the cursed map against his chest. He could see nothing, hear nothing but the thunder sand. His lungs filled with dust, each breath a knife. He screamed Yusuf's name but received no answer, only the roar of 1,000 unseen voices carried on the storm. Through the chaos, He thought he saw towers rising in the haze, black shapes with endless pillars, swaying like trees in a phantom wind. Faces appeared in the storm, mouths open in silent wails, eyes filled with agony. Alistair stumbled, falling to his knees, the map slipping from his grasp. The parchment flapped wildly, its ink bleeding across the page, new lines forming even as the sand tried to claim it. Half the caravan was gone before the storm relented. When at last the winds eased and the world grew still, silence fell like a shroud. The dunes were different now, reshaped into new waves. Of the 30 who had set out, only 15 remained, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths too dry to speak. Where the others had stood, there was nothing. No bodies, no bones, no trace, only smooth sand unbroken, as though the desert had inhaled and swallowed them whole. Alistair clutched the map, his hands bleeding from where the parchment had cut into his skin. He looked at the men who remained, their hollow stares, their trembling limbs, and he knew the truth. The desert had marked them. They were no longer travelers, no longer explorers. They were sacrifices waiting to be claimed. The silence was broken only by a single sound, faint and low, rising from beneath the earth. The groan of pillars straining under invisible weight, as if something ancient shifted restlessly below. The men froze, terror etched into every face. And in that silence, the wind whispered a single word, carried from no human tongue, Ubar. The boys' footprints, the cursed map, the kneeling camels, the storm that swallowed men whole. It was all one story now, woven together by threads of fate. And though half the caravan was gone, Alistair's obsession only deepened. He would press forward. He must, for he had already sacrificed too much to turn back. Yet deep within him, a new fear bloomed, not that the city did not exist, but that it waited for them, hungry. When the storm finally died, silence fell like a burial shroud over the desert. The sky was emptied of its rage, leaving behind a dome of bruised twilight where the sun bled red into the horizon. The dunes had shifted, sculpted anew by the storm's violence, and the survivors stood trembling amid the wreckage of their camp, their eyes hollow, their mouths too dry for words. Half their number had been taken, erased as if they had never walked the earth. No bones, no cloth, no cries, only smooth sand stretching to infinity, hiding its feast well. Alistair Crane could not speak. He clutched the cursed map against his chest, his knuckles white, his heart a drumbeat of disbelief and guilt. Men had followed him into the void, and the void had swallowed them without mercy. Yet he knew there was no turning back. The desert had marked him. The map had chosen him. To retreat was to accept death in the shadow of his failure. To press forward was madness. But obsession had long since strangled reason. The caravan stumbled onward into the newly born silence, their feet sinking into dunes that had not existed the day before. The night came quickly, with stars scattered thick across the sky like diamonds spilled by careless gods. They dared not light a fire. Fear of drawing the attention of whatever hunted them kept them huddled in the cold, their cloaks pulled tight, their breaths shallow. It was in the pale morning light, when the winds had smoothed the surface of the earth, that Yusuf was the first to see it. He had wandered a short distance from camp, his mind restless with half-remembered prayers. There, as the sun edged over the dunes, a strange whiteness broke the monotony of gold. He knelt, brushing the sand aside with his trembling hands, and what emerged froze his blood. Bones. At first, he thought them to be the remains of men, perhaps those claimed by the storm. But as he cleared more of the sand, his heart began to pound in his ears. These were no human bones. They were massive, thick as tree trunks, stretching long beneath the desert skin. A pillar of ivory rose before him, worn and cracked with age, its surface carved with inscriptions that shimmered faintly in the light. He cried out, drawing the others. One by one, the men approached, their faces etched with awe and horror. They fell to their knees, brushing away sand, uncovering more bones, ribs arching like collapsed tunnels, vertebrae as wide as shields. The dunes concealed an entire graveyard, its bones tangled and fused, a city of the dead sleeping beneath shifting sands. Alistair pressed forward, his eyes wide, his breath ragged. "By God, these are ancient," he whispered, His fingers traced the inscriptions, though he could not read them. The markings were not Arabic nor Greek, nor any tongue he had studied. They were jagged, spiraling, curling into shapes that hurt the eyes if studied too long. He felt the grooves with his fingertips and shivered. They pulsed faintly, as though alive, as though the bones themselves remembered the hand that had carved them. The men whispered among themselves. Some crossed themselves. Others muttered verses from the Quran. One fell prostrate, weeping, declaring this was no place for the living. The inscription seemed less like writing and more like warnings, sigils carved to hold something down, not to tell stories. As they uncovered more, the scale became undeniable. These bones were not remnants of men, nor camels, nor any beast of earth they had ever seen. They were colossal, skulls longer than a man's height, rib cages large enough to shelter a caravan beneath them. The skeletons stretched for miles, disappearing under dunes too vast to uncover. And then Yusuf screamed. The men rushed him, and there, half buried in sand, lay a skull unlike the others. It was fused to the earth as though it had grown there, its eye sockets cavernous, staring blind at the sky. But it was not the size that froze them, nor the jagged carvings etched into its brow. It was the crown, a circlet of metal, blackened and fused into the bone, wrapped its skull. Jewels glimmered faintly, dulled by centuries but unmistakable. It had not been placed upon the head. It had grown into it, melded as though the crown and the bone had become one. The men recoiled, their voices rising in panic. "A king!" one whispered. "A king of giants. Cursed by God. This is their punishment." Alistair could not look away. His hands trembled as he reached toward the crown, his mind racing with wonder and dread. What manner of being had ruled this land? Were these the ancients who had built Ubar's pillars, stretching their arrogance skyward? Or were they something older, something not meant for human eyes? The air grew heavy, pressing on their chests. The dunes around them seemed to listen. The silence was no longer silence, but a hell breath, as though the desert waited. One of the men, a soldier hardened by war, spat into the sand. "These are abominations. We should bury them again. Leave this place." His voice quivered though he tried to sound defiant. But Alistair shook his head, his eyes fixed on the skull crowned in darkness. "No, this is proof that the legends were not lies. These are the kings of Ubar or their gods, and if they are here, then the city is near." His words brought no comfort. They brought only fear, for every man felt the weight of unseen eyes watching them, every shadow in the dunes stretching too long, curling like fingers. The sun climbed higher, burning the bones until they gleamed like ivory blades. The men tried to cover them again, shoveling sand in frantic heaps, but the desert resisted. Each gust of wind stripped their work away, revealing the skull, the ribs, the inscriptions, as though the earth itself refused to bury what it had once unearthed. And then it began. A low sound, almost inaudible at first, thrummed through the sand. It was not the wind. It was not the shifting of dunes. It was a voice, deep and hollow, rising from the bones themselves. The men froze, terror locking their limbs. Yusuf fell to his knees, clutching his ears, his face pale with horror. The sound grew, a murmur swelling into chanting. It was not in any tongue they knew, yet the meaning pressed into their minds like a nail driven into flesh. Words of hunger, words of endless sleep, words of kings who were never meant to die. Alistair's heart pounded as he stepped closer to the crowned skull. The chanting pulsed from its hollow cavity, echoing through the desert like a heartbeat. He could feel it in his chest, shaking his bones, rattling his teeth. The sockets of the skull seemed to darken, shadows pooling where eyes should have been. One of the men screamed, dropping his pack, running blindly into the dunes. The others shouted after him, but he did not stop. His scream faded into the vast silence until nothing remained. The chanting deepened. The skull trembled faintly, dust spilling from its jaws. And in that unholy rhythm, Alistair heard his name, not shouted, not called, but whispered, endlessly, insistently, woven into the chant as if the bones themselves knew him. The survivors clutched one another, their eyes wide with despair. Some wept, others prayed, their voices swallowed by the rising drone. The sand shifted beneath their feet, as though the desert itself swayed to the chant. Alistair staggered back, his breath ragged, his body trembling. Yet even in terror, a terrible awe filled him. The skull with its crown was not merely a relic. It was a key, a herald, a warning. And as the chant filled the dawn, Yusuf fell silent, his eyes blank, his lips moving in rhythm with the voice. He spoke words not his own, words older than memory, his voice hollow and alien. The men recoiled, horror cutting deeper than any blade. The chanting from the skull, the chanting from Yusuf's lips, fused into one sound, echoing across the endless dunes. And then, with a groan like mountains shifting, the skull's hollow mouth opened wider. Sand poured from it in rivers, cascading down its jaw, spilling across the desert floor. The chanting rose to a fever pitch, and the survivors realized with a terror that split their souls. This was no graveyard. This was a door. The desert is a cruel mirror. It reflects back the hopes of the thirsty, the desperate, the broken, and it turns them into shimmering illusions that vanish the moment you approach. Men chasing water collapse into dust. Soldiers seeing cities fall to their knees and find only sand. Mirages are the desert's greatest weapon, and the survivors of Alistair Crane's doomed expedition knew better than to trust their eyes. Yet there are some visions that cannot be dismissed, for they arrived not as dreams, but as invitations. It was twilight when they saw them. The sun had dipped low, its last light burning red across the horizon, when the men gasped and froze. Out of the heat haze, far beyond the dunes, towers rose. Not the vague shapes of tricked eyes, not wavering shadows that shift and scatter. These towers stood tall, defined, sharp against the dying sky. Pillars stretching upward like the ribs of titans, gleaming faintly in gold. They pierced the haze with impossible symmetry, not the trembling blur of air, but the solid shape of stone. Yusuf was the first to whisper, his voice trembling. Ubar, the word carried to the caravan like a curse and a prayer, twisting hope and fear into one. Some fell to their knees in awe. Others shielded their eyes, muttering that it could not be real. Alistair's heart thundered in his chest. After all the loss, all the blood, all the voices that haunted their nights, here stood the proof that the map was no lie. But proof in the desert is never mercy. As the twilight deepened, the towers seemed to shimmer, bending faintly in the heat. The men told themselves it was a mirage, yet their hearts betrayed them, for they could see too much. The outline of gates carved with faces, the archways glittering with strange light. And then, faint at first, carried on the wind like a memory, came music. The caravan froze. It was laughter, the sound of pipes and drums, voices raised in joy. It was a living echo of a city breathing, feasting, celebrating. No mirage ever carried sound. No trick of heat had ever sung so sweetly. The men shivered as the music wound through their bones, awakening something long buried in them. Some began to cry, though they did not know why. It was too beautiful, too human, too impossible. Alistair staggered forward, his eyes wet, his lips trembling. "It's there," he whispered. "It's been waiting." But even as hope fluttered in his chest, dread gnawed at the edges, for the music was not steady. It wavered, broke, returned. Laughter turned briefly to weeping before becoming laughter again. The joy carried an undertone of something cracked, something not meant for mortal ears. The men argued. Some begged to turn back, saying this was no city of men but of jinn, that the desert mocked them with voices stolen from the dead. Others cried that they had come too far, suffered too much to abandon it now. Alistair said nothing, for he could not. His gaze was fixed on the towers, his heart chained to them. It was one of the younger travelers, a boy of barely 18, who made the choice for them all. His name was Kareem, a stable hand turned wanderer by hunger. He had lost his brother to the storm, his parents to famine, and his future to the sands. He was hollow, but in that hollowness burned a spark of defiance. "I will see if it is real," he said, his voice steady though his hands shook. The others begged him not to go, cursed him for a fool. But Kareem only smiled, a sad, weary smile, and stepped forward. The dunes sighed under his weight as he descended. Each step carried him closer to the shimmering towers. His figure grew small against the vast horizon, swallowed by the rising haze. Yet the caravan's eyes never left him. When he reached the mirage, silence fell. The music swelled louder, so loud that the men covered their ears, yet seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Kareem stopped, staring up at the towers that loomed impossibly high, their edges burning with light. And then, slowly, fearlessly, he lifted his hand. The caravan held its breath. Kareem touched the illusion. At first, it was as if his hand passed into smoke. The air bent around his fingers, shimmering like water. Yet when he pulled back, his palm glistened wet. "Do." A gasp tore through the men. Kareem laughed, a sound of disbelief, holding his hand high for them to see. "It is real," he shouted. "It breathes. It bleeds water." Hope erupted, wild and dangerous. The men shouted, some crying, some falling to ground in prayer. Alistair staggered forward, his eyes wide with hunger for proof. It was not a lie. Ubar existed. Its towers touched the sky. But then Kareem's laughter broke. The boy stared at his hand. The wetness was no longer dew. It was red, thick, warm. Blood dripped from his fingers, trailing down his wrist, staining the sand beneath him. His eyes widened in horror. He shook his hand, clawed at it, but the blood flowed faster, dripping in steady streams. His laughter turned to a scream. The men watched in silence, their awe shattered into dread. Kareem fell to his knees, clutching his arm, his voice breaking into sobs. The mirage shimmered violently, the towers flickering, the music twisting into shrieks. The laughter became screams, the drums became thunder. The caravan trembled as the twilight darkened, and illusion bled into nightmare. Kareem looked back at them, his eyes wide, his face pale with terror. His lips moved, whispering words they could not hear. And then the towers behind him groaned, their shadows stretching long across the dunes. The mirage had opened its jaws. The last thing the men saw before the haze swallowed Kareem was his hand, dripping blood into sand, the droplets hissing like fire on stone. And then silence. The towers flickered once more, their edges burning, before vanishing into the horizon as though they had never been. The desert lay empty again, endless and silent. No towers, no city, no Kareem, only blood stains in the sand where he had stood. The desert had already taken so much from them, friends, brothers, beasts, sanity itself. Yet still it pressed them forward, like a tide that could not be resisted. After the storm that buried half their number, after the chanting bones beneath the dunes, after the mirage that bled Kareem's life away, the survivors of Alistair Crane's expedition moved as though caught in a dream, their bodies thin, their eyes hollow, their souls pulled onward by something greater than their own will. The cursed map, still bleeding faint lines when touched by moonlight, led them deeper into the empty quarter. Day after day, the horizon shimmered, mocked, resisted. But then, on the seventh dusk after Kareem's disappearance, the sands fell away, and before them rose a sight so vast, so impossible, that even Alistair faltered. The gates. They loomed from the desert like mountains forged by giants, pillars upon pillars stretching upward until they seemed to pierce the dying sun. It was no ruin, no mirage. It was solid, heavy, eternal. The structure was framed by two colossal columns wider than any tower they had ever known, carved from stone blacker than night. Between them yawned a gate, so high it swallowed the horizon, its arch filled with shadows darker than the desert night. The men gasped, some wept, some fell to their knees in prayer. Yusuf's lips trembled as he whispered, "Iram of the pillars, Ubad is real." But wonder quickly gave way to dread, for as the men drew closer, the pillars revealed themselves. They were not plain columns. They were covered, layer upon layer, with carvings of faces. Some smiled serenely, their eyes closed as if in sleep. Others screamed, their mouths twisted wide, their eyes bulging in agony. There were faces of children, of kings, of beasts, of things that bore no resemblance to any creature born of earth. Thousands of them, climbing the stone from base to summit, frozen forever in expressions of joy, terror, despair. The air grew colder as they approached, though the desert sun still hung heavy. Every man felt the same thing. They were being watched, not by God above, but by the countless eyes carved into the stone. Alistair staggered forward, his heart thunderous. He reached out, brushing his fingers against one of the faces. The stone was warm, too warm, as though it had been alive only moments ago. He pulled his hand back quickly, his breath ragged. No one spoke. The silence was too heavy, broken only by the moaning of wind that seemed to echo from inside the gate itself. At last, Alistair raised his hand. "We have come too far," he whispered. "This is the threshold. Beyond this lies Ubar." No one argued. Perhaps they no longer had the strength. Perhaps the dread that curled in their bellies had silenced even their defiance. Slowly, together, the survivors stepped through the shadow of the arch. The moment their feet crossed the threshold, the ground trembled. With a groan that shook the air, the gate began to move. The colossal doors, slabs of stone thicker than fortresses, shifted inward, closing behind them. No wind pushed them. No hand touched them, yet they swung with unstoppable force. The men shouted, panic breaking their silence at last. They rushed back, but it was too late. The gate slammed shut with a thunderous boom, the sound echoing like a funeral bell across the desert. Dust billowed, and when it cleared, they were sealed inside. The light of the setting sun was gone. Darkness swallowed them. Only the pillars remained, rising endlessly into the sky. In the shadows, the faces carved into them seemed to move. Smiles deepened, screams widened, eyes flickered with light. The men pressed against one another, their breaths shallow, their courage breaking. Yusuf clutched Alistair's arm. "We should not be here," he whispered, his voice shaking. "The story said the city was cursed. God destroyed it for its arrogance. We are not explorers. Alistair, we are intruders." Alistair did not answer. His eyes were wide, his face pale, but within him burned the same terrible hunger that had carried him across oceans, jungles, and deserts. His life's purpose was before him, and he would not turn back, even if it cost them all. The men moved deeper into the shadow of the gate, their footsteps hollow against stone older than empires. The air grew thick, heavy with dust and the faint scent of something long buried, rot, incense, blood. And then it happened. A sound, so soft it might have been the desert breathing, drifted through the pillars. A sigh. Every man froze. From high above, where the carvings of faces seemed to climb into eternity, one of the pillars exhaled. Dust poured from his mouth, falling in a slow cascade, glimmering faintly in the dim light. It was not the dry crumble of stone. It was deliberate, steady, as though the pillar itself had sighed after a long, deep sleep. The men stared, their hearts frozen in terror. For in that sigh they heard something ancient waking, something vast and patient, something that had been waiting in the silence of centuries. The dust swirled around them, coating their faces, their lips, their eyes. It clung to their skin like ash from a pyre. And in that dust, some swore they heard voices, faint, distant, chanting names they did not know, yet which their souls seemed to remember. The gate was closed. The desert was gone. The city had claimed them, and the pillars had begun to breathe. The pillars had sighed, and the dust had fallen like the breath of a long-buried god. The men of Alistair Crane's caravan stood frozen in that heavy silence, their hearts beating against their ribs like desperate drums. They were inside now, past the gates of 1,000 pillars, trapped within walls that were less walls and more living monuments. The desert was behind them, but what stretched ahead was something older, darker, and infinitely more dangerous. They pressed forward, for to stand still was to invite madness. Step by weary step, they passed through narrow streets paved with stone that gleamed faintly under their boots. The city of Ubar revealed itself not as ruin alone, but as something between life and death. Towers leaned like broken teeth, yet their carvings still glimmer with faint light. Archways gaped, but from within came whispers and faint sounds, as though the city had not forgotten how to breathe. It was Yusuf who saw the tables first. His voice, hoarse from thirst, trembled. "Look, there." The others followed his gaze. In a great square surrounded by collapsed columns stood rows of tables, stone slabs carved into shapes of feasting boards. Upon them lay food, fruits blackened and swollen, loaves of bread hardened to rock, goblets crusted with wine long turned to vinegar. Yet though the feasts were rotting, they did not decay. The meat glistened with a sheen of centuries-old fat. The fruits dripped with juices that did not dry. The bread cracked but never crumbled into dust. It was as though time itself had been commanded to halt, leaving the banquet eternal and untouched. The men halted, their mouths dry, their bodies trembling with hunger. The sight was a mockery. They had lost so much, bled so much into the sand, and now the city tempted them with a feast they could never consume. Alistair felt his stomach twist. He approached the nearest table, his fingers hovering over a pomegranate that glistened with impossible dew. He wanted to bite into it, to feel the burst of sweetness on his tongue, but something in the air restrained him. The food smelled faintly of iron, faintly of earth freshly dug. It was not nourishment. It was a lure. "Do not touch it," Yusuf whispered sharply. His eyes burned with terror. "This is no feast for men. This is an offering. Look closer." They did, and then their blood turned cold. For shadows sat at the tables. Not figures of flesh, not men, but shapes cast by no light, silhouettes etched into the air itself. They were seated as if mid-feast, their heads bowed, their hands raised mouths that did not exist. They moved in silence, chewing, drinking, swallowing nothing. The shadows stretched and shifted, yet their places were fixed, as though they had sat there for eternity. The men recoiled, some falling to their knees, clutching their beads, their crosses, their scraps of faith. The air grew heavier, pressing against their chests. The silence of the feast was worse than any scream. Alistair's heart pounded as he stepped closer, his curiosity too powerful to resist. One shadow lifted a goblet and tilted it toward the invisible mouth. Though no wine spilled, the sound of liquid trickling echoed faintly in the air. Another raised a knife, carving into the rotting meat. The scrape of steel on bone rang out, though no blade could be seen. "They are not gone," Yusuf whispered, his voice breaking. "They are here still, trapped, feasting forever." The men's eyes darted across the banquet. Every shadow was different, some tall, some small, some twisted beyond recognition. And then it happened. One of the shadows lifted its head. Its face was no longer blank, no longer the emptiness of darkness. Eyes gleamed wet, alive, and the men froze, for those eyes were not unknown. They were human eyes, familiar eyes. The shadow looked directly at them, and Yusuf staggered back with a cry. "That's Khalid." The men gasped. They remembered Khalid, the desert guide, the caravan master who had spoken of the desert's breathing. He had vanished in the storm, his body never found. And now, here he sat, a shadow among shadows, his hollow face bent over the table, his living eyes staring at them with recognition and despair. The silence shattered. The men cried out, some swearing, some weeping, others begging to leave. Alistair's stomach turned to ice. If Khalid was here, if his soul had been caught in this eternal banquet, then the others, their lost brothers, their vanished companions, were they too among these feasting dead? Alistair stepped closer, trembling. "Khalid," he shouted, though his voice cracked. "It is me, Alistair. Speak." The shadow's lips moved. The sound that came was not words, but the faint rasp of breath, the echo of a sigh, the sound of something deeper than language. The air thickened with whispers. The shadows around the table shifted. Slowly, one by one, they lifted their heads, and then the chorus began. A faint murmuring at first, rising into a low drone. The shadows' mouths opened, and from them poured a chant in a language older than the desert. It was not loud, but it shook the men's bones, rattled their teeth, filled their veins with ice. The food on the table shivered, the goblets trembled, the bread cracked. The men clutched their ears, screaming against the sound. Some fell to their knees, convulsing. The chant was not heard with ears alone. It was inside their skulls, pressing into their thoughts, drowning them in waves of sorrow and hunger. And then, most dreadful of all, it happened. Among the survivors, one voice rose to join the chorus. It was not a shadow. It was not one of the lost. It was Fard, one of their own, sitting at the edge of the square, his body shaking. His lips moved with the chant, perfectly in rhythm, his voice blending seamlessly with the dead. The men screamed his name, rushed to him, shook him. His eyes stared blank, his pupils wide, his skin pale. His voice sang with the chorus of shadows, though his body still sat among the living. Alistair's blood ran cold. The city had begun to claim them, not with storms, not with bones, not with blood, but with feasts of silence and songs of the dead. The chorus rose louder, echoing into the night. The tables trembled. The shadows leaned forward, their eyes opening, hundreds of eyes gleaming with hunger. And in that dreadful moment, Alistair knew the truth. The banquet was not theirs to watch. It was theirs to join. The banquet had ended in whispers and dread, the shadows still feasting long after the living dared to turn away. The survivors stumbled from that cursed square like men fleeing a dream too heavy to wake from, their eyes hollow, their hearts bruised with terror. Fard still sat among them, alive yet not, his lips silent now but his breath uneven, as though he carried within him the residue of the chorus he had unwillingly joined. No one dared speak of it, yet all could hear the echo of that dreadful chant lingering in the air, clinging to their very skin. Alistair Crane pushed them forward, though each step seemed heavier than the last. The city pressed inward from every side, its broken towers leaning above them, its endless pillars rising like petrified giants. Every street felt like a throat, every archway a watching eye. And then, as twilight deepened into night, the city revealed what had been leading them toward from the very beginning. It was Yusuf who saw the glow first, faint and unnatural, flickering from beyond a row of collapsed houses. He pointed with trembling hands. "There," he whispered. The men followed the light like moths to flame. They came into a vast courtyard, wider than any they had seen before. At its center rose a temple, not in ruin, not in dust, but standing tall, proud, unbroken by time. Its walls were carved with spirals of flame and wind, its door framed with obsidian blacker than midnight. Above it all, at its summit, burned a fire. The flame rose high, bright and steady, yet it gave off no smoke. Its light shimmered as though caught between worlds, and though the wind whispered to the city, the fire did not bend, did not waver. It was a flame untouched by the elements, a fire that had burned since the world was young. The men stopped in awe, some falling to their knees. One wept, whispering prayers of fear, for in that fire they saw not hope but judgment. Alistair's breath caught in his throat. His life had been devoted to ruins, to relics, to scraps of what had once been. But here, before him, was no ruin. This temple stood alive, waiting, preserved as though it had been hidden from time itself. And the flame was a heart still beating. "We must go inside," Alistair whispered, though the words came out like a plea. The men resisted, their faces pale, their limbs stiff with terror. "No," Yusuf hissed. "Do you not feel it? This place is not for us. It breathes, it watches, it is alive." But the map in Alistair's hands pulsed faintly, its ink glimmering in rhythm with the flame atop the temple. He felt the pull in his chest, irresistible. The city wanted them here. The temple had been waiting. With trembling steps, they crossed the courtyard and entered through the obsidian doors. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with dust and incense long faded. The chamber stretched wide, its ceiling lost in shadows. Along the walls stood statues, black and gleaming, their faces hidden, their hands folded. The silence pressed against their ears like a weight. At the far end of the chamber, upon a dais of stone, stood the figure that froze every man where he stood. It was a statue, carved from pure obsidian, towering above them, its form human yet not, its shoulders broad, its face severe, its eyes hollow. Its hands rested on its knees, its mouth slightly open, as if caught between silence and speech. The statue seemed to drink the light, swallowing the flame's glow until the room itself felt darker for its presence. The men dared not move. Their breaths were shallow, their bodies rigid. They had seen too much already, bones that chanted, feasts of shadows, mirages that bled. But this was worse, for the statue did not feel like stone. It felt like something waiting. They stood in silence for what felt like hours, the air growing heavier, their hearts pounding in unison. No one dared to speak. And then, without warning, the silence broke. The statue spoke. Its mouth did not move. No breath stirred from its lips. But its voice filled the chamber, deep and resonant, echoing in their skulls, pressing into their bones. You have come to the city that is never lost. The men cried out, some falling to their knees, others clutching their ears. But Alistair stood frozen, his eyes wide, his body trembling. The voice was not sound, it was thought. It did not enter through the ears, but through the soul itself. The statue continued. Ubar was not destroyed. The words shook the air, reverberating through the chamber. It was hidden. The men shivered, their eyes darting to Alistair, to Yusuf, to one another, as though hoping to find comfort, but finding none. Punished for its arrogance, Ubar sank beneath the sands. Not by God, not by storm, not by time, but by its own hand. The kings thought themselves eternal. They bound their city in chains of stone and flame. They defied heaven, they mocked the stars. And so they buried themselves. Ubar chose to sleep. The voice rolled like thunder, shaking the floor, rattling the walls. The statues along the sides trembled, their hidden faces seeming to twitch in the dim light. Yet even in punishment, Ubar waited. It dreamed. It listened. And when the sands called for sacrifice, it awoke. Alistair's knees buckled. He fell against the stone floor, his hands clutching the map that had led them here. His life's pursuit, his endless obsession, had been fulfilled, but it was no triumph. It was a revelation drenched in terror. The city was not lost. It had never been lost. It had been waiting. The men whimpered, some weeping openly, others praying feverishly, though their prayers sounded hollow against the weight of that voice. Yusuf clutched his head, his face pale with despair. We should not be here. We are not meant to hear this. But the statue was not finished. You have seen the bones. You have heard the feast. You have walked among the pillars. Now you know this is no city of man. This is a city of memory, a city of punishment, a city of hunger. And still you entered. The words cut through them like blades. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. The flame above the temple flickered, burning brighter, though still no smoke rose. Then, slowly, terribly, the statue's eyes began to glow. At first faint, like embers hidden in ash, then brighter, until they burned red, casting light across the chamber. The men shielded their eyes, their hearts racing. Alistair could not move. He was transfixed, his soul chained to that obsidian gaze. And then the statue's mouth opened. Sand poured forth. Not dust, not air, sand, steady and endless, spilling from its lips, cascading down the dais, pooling across the floor. It hissed as it spread, filling the chamber with its dry breath, swallowing the sound of their cries. The men staggered back, their feet slipping, their throats choking on dust. The sand poured faster, spilling like a river, as though the desert itself had been trapped within the statue and was now being released. Alistair tried to scream, but his voice broke. Yusuf clutched his arm, his eyes wide with horror. Fard felt his knees again, his lips moving, his voice joining the unseen chorus of the dead. The sand climbed higher, reaching their ankles, their knees. The statue's eyes burned brighter, its mouth gaping wider, the torrent of sand unending. And in that dreadful moment, Alistair understood. The oracle of Ubar was not a guide. It was a gate, and the city was not done with them yet. The sand poured from the obsidian statue's mouth as if the desert itself had been imprisoned within its hollow chest. The men screamed, staggering back as the torrent rose around their knees, their waists, their chests. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The temple fell silent. The air was heavy, thick with dust. The fire above still burned, still gave no smoke. The statue's eyes dimmed, yet the memory of their glow still seared the men's minds. The survivors of Alistair Crane's doomed expedition stood trembling. Coated in a skin of dust, their lips cracked, their eyes wild. No one spoke for a long time, for each man carried the same dread. The city was not merely showing them relics of its past. It was speaking. It was teaching. It was remembering. And soon, it began to reveal its greatest memory of all, Underscore, 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 underscore. It began the next morning, as they stumbled from the temple into streets washed in pale light. The city was quiet, but not dead. The air itself seemed to hum faintly, carrying whispers just beyond comprehension. Alistair rubbed his temples, his skull aching from the echoes of the oracle's voice. Yet his eyes burned with something else, an obsession so strong it devoured even his fear. He had come to Ubar to find proof of its existence, and now it gave him not only proof, but revelation. But revelations are rarely merciful. The visions began with Yusuf. He had lagged behind, his steps faltering, his face pale. Then, without warning, he screamed. His body stiffened, his eyes rolled back, and he fell to his knees. The others rushed to him, clutching his shoulders. But Yusuf's mouth opened and a torrent of words poured out. Words in no language any of them knew, yet which clawed their souls as if they had always known them. As Yusuf's voice filled the square, the city itself seemed to change. The air thickened, the pillars groaned, and before their eyes, the ruins shifted. Towers rose, rebuilt in shadow. Streets filled with people, shapes of men and women, tall and proud, draped in silks, their brows circled with gold. Laughter echoed. Music filled the air. Ubar lived again. The explorers staggered back, clutching one another. They were surrounded by visions of the city as it once had been. They saw the kings of Ubar, tall men with eyes like obsidian, leading processions through streets lined with treasure. They saw merchants from distant lands, their camels heavy with spices and jewels, welcomed through the gates with songs. They saw feasts of gold and fire, pillars rising ever higher, their peaks piercing the sky. It was magnificent. It was terrifying. And then the visions grew darker. The laughter cracked into arrogance. The kings raised their hands not in blessing but in defiance. They built their pillars higher, higher still, so that they might reach the heavens. They mocked the sky, declaring themselves eternal, beyond the grasp of gods. They carved their triumph into the stone of their towers, their faces into the very bones of their city. The explorers watched in horror as the visions twisted into storm. The sky blackened, thunder roared. Lightning split the heavens. Wind screamed across the city, tearing banners from their poles. The towers shook, their pillars groaning. The people screamed, their feasts collapsing, their jewels scattering like raindrops into sand. Floods poured through the streets, sweeping men and women into the abyss. The towers bent, then broke, crashing down upon those who had worshipped them. The laughter of kings turned to cries of despair. And through it all, above the chaos, a voice thundered from the sky, a voice without form, without body, only power. You have defied the sky. You have mocked the heavens. Now you will sleep beneath the sands, forever forgotten, forever cursed. The explorers clutched their ears, but the voice was inside them, rattling their bones, burning their veins. Yusuf screamed again, his body shaking as the visions poured through him. His voice cracked with pain, yet still the words came, forced from his throat like blood from a wound. Then, suddenly, the visions ended. The city fell silent once more. The towers were ruins again. The streets were empty. Yusuf collapsed, his body limp, his breath ragged. The men dragged him up, but his eyes were wide and blank, his lips still moving, repeating the same word over and over. Punish, punish, punish. Alistair staggered back, his chest heaving. He knew then what the oracle had meant. Ubar had not been destroyed by time, nor by men. It had been buried alive, its arrogance chained beneath the sands by the wrath of the sky. Not death, not annihilation. A punishment worse than both, to live forever in silence, in hunger, in memory. And yet, something gnawed at him. The visions had not felt like memories. They had not carried the distant haze of what had been. They had been sharp, alive, pressing into him as though they were happening now. It was Yusuf who gave voice to what Alistair dared not say. His hollow eyes turned toward them, his voice weak but steady. "They are not memories," he whispered. "They are warnings." The words sank into the men like knives. Warnings. The storms, the floods, the collapsing towers. They were not visions of the past, but the future. Ubar's fate was not merely remembered. It was waiting to be repeated. The men argued in fear, some swearing they must leave at once, others insisting it was already too late. But the city gave them no choice. For even as they trembled, the air grew heavy again. A sound split the silence. At first, it was faint, like the groan of stone, then louder, like the rumble of thunder. The ground trembled beneath their feet. The pillars shivered. The men clutched one another, their faces pale with terror. And then from above, a booming crack tore through the air. It was not lightning, not thunder. It was the sound of the sky itself breaking. The men screamed, falling to their knees. Alistair lifted his eyes to the heavens, and for one dreadful moment he saw it. A fracture, faint but unmistakable, running across the dome of the sky, as if the heavens themselves were splitting open. The crack in the sky lingered above them, faint but undeniable, as if the heavens themselves had split under the weight of Ubar's curse. The survivors of Alistair Crane's expedition stood frozen in the ruined square, their eyes locked on the fracture overhead, their souls heavy with the dread of what it meant. It was Yusuf who whispered what all of them feared. The punishment is not finished. It begins again. His words hung in the silence like a death knell. Then the ground shivered. At first it was subtle, a faint vibration beneath their boots, like the tremor of a faraway storm. But then the sand shifted. The cobbled stones of Ubar's streets cracked, dust spilling upward, grains rising as if defying gravity. One man shouted in horror as the ground beneath his feet turned soft, swallowing his boots. He thrashed, screaming, but the desert had turned liquid. The others rushed to him, but it was useless. The earth itself had become quicksand, pulling him down with greedy strength. His arms flailed wildly, his face contorted in terror. "Help me, for God's sake!" But there was no saving him. Within moments, the sand consumed him, dragging him screaming into its depths. Silence followed, until his scream echoed back, not from his throat, but from beneath the ground. The survivors stumbled back, their breaths ragged, their eyes wild. The desert was rising, not as storm, not as mirage, but as hunger. The streets flowed like rivers of gold and ash, dragging at their ankles, their legs, pulling them down into the belly of the city. And then came the voices, at first faint, like whispers in the wind, then louder, heavier, filling the air with a chorus of despair. Shapes began to rise in the sand, figures of men and women, their bodies withered, their skins stretched thin, their eyes hollow and dark. They emerged slowly, dragging themselves from beneath the surface, their mouths opening wide in silent cries. The explorers screamed, staggering back as the dead of Ubar rose around them. There were dozens and hundreds, their forms breaking free of the sand like corpses pulled from a grave. Some were draped in robes that had rotted to tatters, others crowned in broken circlets of bronze and gold. Yet none bore the fury of vengeance in their faces. Instead, they looked hollow, empty, desperate. Alistair froze, his heart hammering, his mind refusing to believe. But Yusuf, trembling, spoke what none dared to. They do not want revenge. They want replacements. The truth crashed over them like a storm. These were not spirits haunting the ruins. These were prisoners of the city, bound to its curse, their souls unable to escape. And now, with the living among them, they sought release, not by destroying, but by trading places. The dead reached out, their fingers skeletal, their hollow eyes fixed on the explorers. One man shrieked as a withered hand grasped his arm. He thrashed, but the grip was iron, pulling him into the sand. His comrades tried to drag him free, but the sand itself swallowed them, sucking them down as the dead rose higher. Their screams cut off into silence, replaced by a new shadow rising, wearing their faces. The survivors scattered, stumbling to the flowing streets. Everywhere, the dead emerged, their hollow eyes gleaming faintly, their mouths opening in wordless pleas. The men cried out for mercy, but mercy was not in Ubar's nature. Alistair stumbled against a pillar, his breath ragged. He clutched the cursed map, its ink now bleeding uncontrollably, dripping down his hands like fresh blood. He wanted to burn it, to tear it, to cast it away, but it clung to him as though fused to his skin. The ground shivered again, louder now, shaking the pillars that loomed above them. Dust rained down. The faces carved into stone seemed to shift, their mouths opening wider, their eyes hollowing deeper. And then, with a groan that shook the heavens, one pillar cracked. The sound was deafening, like mountains breaking. The men froze, their terror silenced by awe. The pillar shuddered, its carving splitting, dust pouring from its cracks. And then, slowly, horribly, the stone began to peel away. From within the pillar, a figure emerged. It was not shadow nor corpse. It was something trapped, something imprisoned for centuries. Its body was fused with stone, its arms breaking free of rock like wings torn from a mountain. Its eyes opened, glowing faintly with the same ember light as the oracle statue. It took one step, and the ground shivered. The men screamed, some falling to their knees, others fleeing. But there was nowhere to run. Another pillar cracked, then another. One by one, the 1,000 pillars of Ubar began to crumble, their stone shells breaking, their prisoners stepping free. Figures of kings and priests, soldiers and slaves, their forms half stone, half flesh, their eyes glowing with hunger. They did not roar, they did not rage. They only exhaled dust, long sighs that shook the air like the breath of an ancient god. The survivors clutched one another, their sanity unraveling. They had come seeking a city of gold, a city of legend, a city forgotten by time. But what they had found was a prison, and the walls were breaking. Alistair's heart thundered. His body screamed to run, but his soul was chained. He looked at the figure stepping from the pillars, and for a terrible moment, he thought he saw himself among them, his face etched in stone, his eyes hollow, his lips whispering in silence. The sand rose higher, swirling around them like a tide. The dead pressed closer, their hollow eyes fixed on the living. The pillars groaned louder, cracking open, releasing more prisoners. And then, with a sound like the heavens collapsing, the largest of the pillars split down the middle. From within, something vast began to stir. The men fell silent, their terror too great for screams. The city trembled, the air cracked, and the sands rose higher still, hungering, pulling, feeding. And as the dust swallowed them, the truth burned clear in Alistair's mind. Ubar was not a city lost in the desert. Ubar was the desert, and it was feeding again. The wind that moved through Ubar that night was not a wind that belonged to the desert. It was colder, heavier, as though it carried centuries of sighs pressed into its breath. The survivors, weary and broken from nights of endless wandering, thought they had finally found a way out. The gates had appeared before them, jagged stone pillars that seemed to part like the ribs of some colossal beast. And beyond them, the promise of sand dunes and open sky. But Ubar was no ordinary city. It was never content to let its prey walk free. They ran through streets that twisted like snakes, corridors that shifted beneath their very feet, roads folded back into themselves, turning paths straight into circles. Columns that had been upright only moments before leaned and bent, closing like jaws, forcing them back toward the heart of the city. With every step, it became clearer that Ubar was not ruins, nor stone, nor dust. It was alive, and it was hungry. Fear gnawed at them in silence. Not one dared to shout, for the city seemed to listen. Their breaths were ragged. Their hearts clanged in their chests like temple bells struck an alarm. It was Yasin, the leader who had first found the curse map, who raised his hand for stillness. His eyes burned in the dim torchlight, not with courage, but with a hollow fire that belonged to someone already claimed. "Do you feel it?" he whispered, though whispering in Ubar was as useless as throwing sand against tide. "The walls are watching. They do not want us to leave." The group exchanged glances. They had long felt it, though no one dared admit it aloud. Ubar was not a place you entered. It was a thing you awakened. Its foundations thrived not on stone or water, but on explorers. Those who dared uncover its name, trace its bones on maps, or whisper its legends by campfire. Every new soul who entered gave it strength. Every new death allowed it to rise again from the dunes. And those who tried to leave discovered that Ubar did not release its offerings. The desert around them pulsed like a mirage. Arches rearranged themselves. The very stars above twisted, as if the sky itself were being bent to the city's will. Layla, the youngest among them, clutched the remnants of her journal to her chest. Her fingers were torn and bloodied from dragging her body against shifting stones. She whispered, half to herself and half to the air, "It feeds on us. Every step we take, every fear we breathe, it drinks it." Yasin's gaze turned toward her, and in his eyes, the others saw the truth they wished to deny. His skin glistened not with sweat, but with a faint red glow, like veins filled with burning coals. The cursed map, once a fragile parchment, was gone. Its lines, its rivers, its markings of streets and chambers, they had burned themselves into his flesh. They crawled across his arm like serpents of ink and fire, winding around his shoulder, spreading down his chest. The map had chosen him. At first, he had screamed when the flames carved into his body, when the veins of Ubar's streets etched themselves into his very skin. But now, the screaming was done. Yasin no longer resisted. The pain had become something else, something binding. He was no longer merely a man in the city. He was becoming the cartographer of doom, the living parchment on which Ubar could rewrite itself again and again. The others feared him. They began to whisper of abandoning him. For what good was a leader if the city had claimed him? But abandoning him meant abandoning the map, and without it, even cursed as it was, they would never see the way out. And then, as though the city sensed their growing despair, the gate appeared again. It was sudden, violent. A tearing of stone and sand, a collapse of pillars that gave way to a vast opening. Through it shimmered the dunes, endless and silver beneath the moonlight. A rush of cool desert air filled the passage, and for a heartbeat, hope surged in their chests. But that hope was short-lived. A voice rolled through the stones, not in words but in the deep groaning of mountains, in the hiss of sandstorms, in the low moan of buried caverns. Yet the meaning was clear, sinking into their bones as if spoken directly to their blood. One may leave, no more. The survivors froze. Every drop of blood in their veins turned cold. The city had given them a choice, but not mercy. Ubar had always demanded sacrifice. To walk free meant leaving another behind, trapped forever in its labyrinth, swallowed into its hunger. Only one step beyond the gate would be allowed, and once the gate closed, it would be as if it had never existed at all. Arguments erupted, desperate and raw. Some screamed that the strongest should go, to tell the world what they had seen. Others cried that the youngest must be spared, for she had not yet lived her life. Yet others stared silently, their minds already broken, accepting that they were fated to die where they stood. But Yasin said nothing. He stood apart, the cursed map burning brighter with every breath. His veins glowed as though lit by torches beneath his skin. He lifted his arm, and the map shifted across him, pulsing, redrawing itself with streets no mortal hand had traced. The city was alive upon him, and he was alive only because it allowed it. Layla's voice trembled. "It will not let us choose. The city will decide." Her words proved true, for as the gate yawned wider, the ground beneath them split, and the walls bent forward. The city was tightening, pressing them toward a decision. Stones groaned like the ribs of a giant closing in on prey. Yasin stepped forward, his voice hollow. "It wants a sacrifice. It always has. And I am already claimed." The others protested, but deep down they knew Ubar had chosen his cartographer, and such a curse could never walk free. Yasin's role was sealed. To remain, to draw, to trap the next explorers who came seeking gold, glory, or forgotten truth. And yet, even as he spoke, the city laughed, not in sound but in movement. The gate flickered like a mirage. The path out shimmered with an impossible lure. Ubar's cruelty was not only in demanding sacrifice, it was in tempting them to betray each other, to claw, to kill, to prove that the city's hunger was already within their hearts. Blood dripped from the ceiling like tears of stone. Shadows twisted into forms of past explorers. Faces gaunt, eyes hollow, mouths open in silent screams. The survivors knew then that the city did not merely consume flesh. It consumed memory, it consumed history, it consumed identity. To remain was to become a whisper in its walls, a shadow among its ruins. The silence broke with a sob. One of them, Kareem, the elder whose legs had long failed, fell to his knees. Let me be the one. I have nothing left. Let the young live. Let them carry word of what we saw. But before he could finish, the floor shifted beneath him, dragging him back. The city refused him. The sacrifice was not his to give. Layla screamed. Her torch flared and then extinguished, plunging them into half-darkness. The map upon Yasin's skin glowed brighter, illuminating the despair on every face. And as the light pulsed, they saw the truth burn into the very lines of that living parchment. Every path, every gate, every exit led not away from Ubar, but deeper into its heart. The city bent the rules because it could. The gate would open, yes, but one step through it, and one soul would vanish into the walls, claimed forever. Only one could live, and that life would be branded with the memory of the other's screams. Yasin raised his hand, the cursed map alive upon him, his voice breaking with both sorrow and finality. If I step forward, I remain. If one of you steps forward, you live, but only because the city feeds on me. This is its will. This is the bargain. The survivors wept, torn between relief and horror. To leave meant carrying the cursed memory. To stay meant being consumed by Ubar's endless hunger. The gate roared wider. The choice had to be made. And then, silence. The city waited. The air thickened, heavy as molten lead. The survivors clutched at their throats, choking not on dust, but on dread. Ubar was not merely stone and sand. It was judgment, and it would not close until its price was paid. The last sound was the crunch of footsteps, one survivor stepping forward toward the open gate, their shadows stretching across the burning light. The others watched, paralyzed between grief and fury, knowing the moment that shadow crossed the threshold, the city would claim its sacrifice. The gate pulsed, the city breathed, and then the stone groaned shut, leaving only one figure upon the sands outside, while within, the walls shuddered in satisfaction, sealing the doom of the rest. The desert had gone quiet, not the ordinary silence of endless dunes, where the wind whispered like a forgotten hymn. No, this was deeper, hollow, absolute, as though the world itself had stopped breathing. The last survivor staggered forward, his body broken, his eyes haunted, his lips cracked with the taste of dust and despair. Behind him, the city was dying, Atlantis of the sands. The fabled lost city men had chased through centuries of myths, that glittering jewel whispered of an old caravan tales. The city of brass gates and ivory towers, the city where kings once drank from bowls carved of starlight, was sinking once more into the embrace of the desert. He did not look at first. His body begged him to move, to run, to leave its tragedy behind. But curiosity, as it always had, turned his head one last time, and there it was. What moment ago had been streets filled with burning lamps, mosaics of turquoise and gold, fountains where water leapt as though it were alive, was now nothing. The dunes had shifted. The sands rose with the grace of curtain falling on the final act of play, smoothing themselves into flawless waves. Every column, every dome, every statue was erased, as if the city had never existed. A blank desert stretched into eternity, empty and cruel. He stumbled, his knees nearly buckling. His hands trembled. Had he truly seen it? Or was it nothing more than fever's trick, a dream painted on the canvas of thirst and madness? His throat burned as if fire had lived there, but still he whispered to himself, because silence was unbearable. It was real, he croaked. I was there. The desert gave him no answer. Only wind, cruel in its indifference, brushed his ragged clothes and carried away his words. He reached into his pocket, as though to prove it to himself, to anchor his soul in some evidence of what his eyes swore was true. His fingers touched the grains. They were colder than they should have been. Cold like shadow, cold like stone buried in water. He lifted them out, spilling them into his palm. The sand was not like the rest of the desert. It bled. Not blood as a man knows, but an ink-dark substance that pulsed faintly, as if alive. The grains writhed, sliding together, reshaping, rearranging themselves into lines and circles. He stared horrified, entranced, unable to move. A new map formed in the hollow of his hand, shifting, changing, breathing with each beat of his faltering heart. His chest tightened. Pain lanced his ribs, but still he could not look away. The map showed rivers that no longer flowed, mountains ground flat by time, roads carved across nothingness, and at its heart, the city. Always the city, always waiting. A tremor went through him, not from the cold night wind that swept across the dunes, but from within, from a knowledge that no man should bear. The city was not lost. It had never been lost. It only hid itself, folding between sands and shadows, slipping out of reach until it chose again to rise. And it chose its survivors. He fell to his knees, clutching his chest. His strength was gone. The desert had drained it. Hunger gnawed him hollow. Thirst burned him empty, and yet his mind was aflame. He had seen things inside the city, things no mortal tongue dared to name. Towers that whispered, statues that breathed when no one watched, mirrors that reflected not the face but the soul. He had seen men who entered whole and walked out shattered, eyes glassy, minds broken by truths too sharp to hold. He was the last, and he knew why. The city did not keep survivors. It kept secrets. And yet, somehow, it had allowed him to leave. Or perhaps, he thought bitterly as he pressed the blackened sand tighter in his palm. It had sent him. The horizon stretched before him, endless, merciless. Stars burned like cruel witnesses, uncaring, immortal. His body was failing, but his heart beat stubbornly, carrying him forward a few more paces. Every step toward his flesh. But still he walked. He had to, because the city had given him a message. He thought of the companions who had walked with him into the dunes. Brave men, foolish men, greedy men, all dead now. Their bones left beneath the collapsing streets of the phantom city. Some had begged to turn back. Others had laughed, blinded by visions of gold. He alone had staggered free, though what remained of him was scarcely human. He could almost hear their voices now, carried on the wind, calling his name with bitterness, with blame. Why you? Why only you? He could not answer. Each step grew heavier. His shadow lengthened on the white sands. The weight of the desert pressed down like an ocean, and he knew he could go no further. His knees struck the earth. His lips pressed to the sand. He tasted dust, bitter and sharp, and for a moment he thought perhaps this was fitting, to return to the same earth that had consumed empires, to vanish as countless wanderers had before him. But the sand in his hand still pulsed, alive, whispering. It urged him to speak, to leave behind words that could not be swallowed, that could not be erased. He raised his head, forcing breath into his failing lungs. His eyes were wide, burning with fever, yet in their depths a strange light glowed. He whispered, "The city is never lost. It is waiting." The words seemed to linger in the air, etched against the stars, carried far beyond the dunes by winds that never tired. They were the last words he spoke, and yet they did not die with him. They sank into the desert, into the grains themselves, into the black sand map that still pulsed faintly even as his body fell still. The desert shifted once more. The dunes swallowed him as they had swallowed the city, erasing all trace. When the wind passed, the sands were smooth, flawless, perfect, no footprints, no body, no blood, only silence. But far away, where caravans would one day rest and storytellers would gather by firelight, his words would echo, a rumor, a whisper, a curse. And in the pocket of time where the city slept, the gates of brass stirred faintly, as though hearing his promise. The Atlantis of the sands was never gone. It was waiting, waiting for the next fool, waiting for the next dreamer, waiting as it always had. And in the palm of the dead man's hand, buried now beneath the dune, the map still bled and shifted. Not lost, not gone, only waiting. When the sands fall silent and the wind carries nothing but echoes, the fate of Ubar lingers like a question no one dares to answer. Perhaps the city still breathes beneath the dunes, its 1,000 pillars standing in the dark, waiting for the day when the desert loosens its grip. Or perhaps it was never a city at all. Only a memory stitched into human longing, a warning carved into the bones of time. But as you sit with this tale, ask yourself, how many other forgotten places lie hidden, erased, and waiting? How many truths have slipped through our fingers, buried by the same earth that once cradled them? If this story stirred something within you, awe, sorrow, or the quiet ache of mystery, then come closer. This fire never dies, and there are countless more tales waiting in the shadows. Cities that vanish without a trace, cursed lands where no man dares to walk, and whispers of civilization swallowed whole. Leave your thoughts in the embers below. Share this story with those who hunger for the mysteries of the past. And if you wish to journey further into forgotten corners of history, then subscribe. Stay with us, and together, we'll walk roads no map dares to draw and uncover secrets the world tried to bury forever.